Welcome to the Multidose Podcast, your guide to authenticity, hosted by Mulsum Sia. Brought to you by the Multipath. This podcast is more than just insights, it's your dose of authenticity. Join us as experts, celebrities, influencers, and real people share their authentic knowledge like never before. From every episode, you can expect to learn something new and maybe explore a new perspective on your own life. To support our podcast, consider donating to our Patreon and share the love on social media. Every like, follow, comment, share, and penny counts. Find us on all streaming platforms and connect with us on our social media at The Multipath and at Mulsum Sia. Your authenticity is just one dose away.
So, Victor, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast now, discussing topics and ideas and throwing about your experience prior to even coming on this and on the podcast has been both thrilling and insightful for me. As I said, this podcast, I probably will do less talking and let you take the lead. And in that same respect, I will tap out and let you continue to carry on the introduction of your experience, actually. And let's start off with your literacy background and how that will link, hopefully, into your therapy and coaching background as well. Take it away.
Yes, well, I'd been living in America, in Miami, during the dot-com boom. And I'd accidentally made a lot of money and then lost it. Long story. But I thought it's time to do something useful. And I was walking down Earls Court Road and I bumped into an old friend and business partner I hadn't seen for years. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I've been doing this, that, and the other in America, and but I want to get back to doing something useful." And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm running a software company in India." And India is somewhere I visited quite a lot, and I absolutely love the place. And I've been looking for any excuse to go there. And so we did a deal. He said, "You come and help me with my software company, because I do have some IT training. And I will get my funders to make sure you have funding to run an NGO to do whatever you want to do in India." And I said, "Terrific." And next week I had a one-way ticket to northern India. I got on a plane with 4 suitcases and went to, I got met and I got taken to a train station, put on a train, and ended up in a town called Ludhiana. And spent the next year living in a 5-star hotel, spending half my time helping with the software company, which was writing programs for English primary schools, as it so happens, very good ones. And the other half of the time trying to do NGO work, because at that time, massive amounts of India was still, poverty doesn't explain what it was. That basically you're talking about outside the big towns, you're talking about an agricultural country where people live on subsistence, they're working in the fields, they have medical provisions are very poor by our standards. And education standards aren't that good by our standards either. So my intention was to do mental health, because I thought I can bring all my experience and knowledge about mental health and hopefully do something useful in India, where I'm sure mental trauma is just as bad as anywhere else. Actually, I assumed it was much worse. And part of the reason I wanted to go to India was because so many children in those days were dying or getting sick before the age of 5 compared to other countries. And that I assumed would have a massive traumatic effect on their parents, which it obviously does. But when I got there, I found very little mental health infrastructure at all. And cut a long story short, I was standing in a field next to the district health officer one day, surveying the limitless fields of Punjab and the crops they're growing. And he said, I said, look, I'm trying to do this mental health education, and I'm finding it very difficult. I said, because they can't read the booklets, they can't read the posters, they've had no exposure to these ideas. And I hadn't realized how illiterate they all were, because I'd been reading government statistics, which weren't accurate. So he says, yeah, that's right. If how are you going to do health education with people who can't read and write? And even if you did, is it going to stick?
Yeah.
So at that point, I kind of went off and saw my friends who run a big NGO in Delhi. And I said, we've got to do a literacy program. And they said, yes. And I said, what's the best literacy program in India? And they say, we don't know. There may not be a best literacy program at all. So I spent the next 2 months researching, and I discovered that there had been various campaigns at various times, but when I was there, nothing was really going on. So I thought, right, if I can do a literacy campaign and get people to learn to read and write, then they can get health education. Their children will stop getting sick and dying, and their mental health will improve. And maybe later on, I can get back to mental health. Anyway, so there I am in Delhi now, moved out the 5-star hotel, living in Delhi, and working with this NGO called Development Alternatives, and being mentored by them on how you do this stuff. Which is something I never worked in a developing country before. So I then spent 2 years building a literacy program from scratch, which included going to all the experts around the world, talking to them. I mean, I remember one time I got on a plane to Scotland because I thought the best literacy experts were working in Glasgow. Anyway, I went to see them, and I said, what's the secret of your success? So I learned from them. I spoke to people at Royal Holloway College. I spoke to the experts in the US, and so on and so forth. And I came to the conclusion that nobody had really cracked this. Child literacy, yes, obviously schools all over the world are teaching kids to read and write. And there's various ways of doing it and all the rest of it. And that's quite a sort of an advanced technology, if you like, of how you do that. But adult literacy, no, different ballgame, completely different ballgame.
It's quite an interesting point that you've made in terms of you went out and you didn't try to, I guess, tackle the world and all the problems in developing countries by yourself. You connected with the right people. An interesting point, and actually something that I always think about, but I think my audience will appreciate this, is how, if they wanted to make a difference, because I know a lot of people that want to do volunteering work and charity work, how would they contact people that are experts in their field? How did you manage to, I guess, invoke their interests in helping you, giving you their advice and their counsel?
Trial and error. I mean, this doesn't fall into your lap. I remember the first thing I did was I did an analysis of where in the world were the worst problems, which, this is not a new thing. This is an old thing. This has been going on for many, many years. But when I started doing a numerical analysis of it, terrorism itself does not it causes serious problems, makes a lot of news, but numerically it's not a big deal. I mean, I don't want to downplay it. Obviously, it's really serious. I've had a lot of, well, not a lot, but quite a few terrorist incident victims. But in numeric terms, where is the biggest harm in the world? And the biggest harm in the world, I'm still not quite sure, but in terms of in developing countries like India and Bangladesh, where you don't have good medical provision, or you didn't then, you get a massive amount of trauma. Because we in the UK or the US or Spain or wherever, we get sick, we go to the doctor. You can't just do that in a developing country. There's either no doctor, or the doctor comes, or the nurse comes around on a bus once a week, or they don't have the they don't have the drugs, because the drugs have to be kept in fridges, and they don't have the electricity supply, constant electricity supply, to keep the drugs in the right temperature, so the drugs go off, and that makes everything. I mean, there's a whole load of problems that most people are just not aware of. So I'm looking at what is the biggest bang for the buck you can do to help people. And that's how what I ended up doing in India is that the biggest bang for the buck was actually, I thought, was sanitize the water supply and the and make sure they all have toilets. And in fact, that wasn't the answer, because well, yes, it was intuitively correct, but not actually correct. Because lots of programs. I remember the first week I was there, I went to a conference where everybody stood up and moaned about how they tried to get people to use toilets, and instead they got used for plant pots or storage or anything but toilets. And at that point, there was more mobile phones in India than there were toilets.
But why was that? Was that just a lack of education how to use it? Was that because of culture, tradition, backgrounds? Was it just a condemnation of anything novel?
No, two reasons. Reason number one is there was no health education, so they didn't realize that sanitary issues affected health.
Okay.
Right.
Makes
So,
sense. Yeah.
you know, your typical rural Indian woman or man or woman goes out, who works in the agricultural sector, which is a huge number, goes to a specially designated field and has their morning poo in the designated field. And when the men want to pee, they just pee wherever they feel like it. But they did not know, they don't have the knowledge to say, oh, there's a link between this and our children getting sick. So that's why health education is important. I mean, since in the last 20 odd years since I've started this, there's a huge amount of health education gone on, and the picture has changed quite considerably. But at the time I was there were 400 million people who couldn't read or write, 400 million. So that's why I thought I have to do a literacy program. And I spent 2 years researching it, came up with it, and it's called Tara Aksha. And we started in 2005, and we took our first, we did trial and error in lots and lots of villages. And eventually we did our first proper program with 18 villages outside of Delhi. And after a few weeks, they could all read and write.
Wow.
So we had a graduation ceremony, because they love graduation ceremonies, and we invited the VIPs and yada yada, had got the microphones in, and these women who normally would cover themselves up with their saris, they gave speeches. I mean, this is unheard of. You know, these people don't stand up in the middle of a crowd and give a speech. Anyway, they did. They were full, you know, they were overjoyed that they'd learned to read and write. And there was one point where one woman stood up and she says, she's holding a piece of paper, and she says, I and my friends have written a poem. I am going to read you it. And she's standing there with this Hindi written, beautiful handwriting on a piece of paper they'd written. Now, bear in mind, 6 weeks before this, they could not read or write at all. They'd never been to school.
Wow. 6 weeks.
So, 6 weeks.
Wow.
We got it. Yeah. So she stands up and reads this poem. And at that point, I lost it. I was just like, it works. I've been working on this for 2 years. Up until the week before, I still wasn't sure whether it was going to work. But at that point, I realized, yes, it's going to work.
It worked.
It worked. And over the next few years, we made 250,000 women literate.
Wow. 250,000. That's a massive accomplishment. Massive.
Well, yeah, but there's still another 375 million to go. But that's another story.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's easy for you to look at what you haven't achieved, but come on, look what you've achieved. Like, I think I couldn't even imagine making it a difference that big. Like, okay, in the grand scheme of things, yes, it's like a tiny dent in the number, but you still made a dent at least. Like, you left something, you did something with it.
I think the most important thing from my point of view, there's two things that were important. One was the fact that as I say, this was 2 years of research to get the technique right. So we found a brilliant technique that makes sure they learnt, because we had a very low dropout rate. Adult literacy programs across the world are notorious for high dropout rates. Ours was very low dropout rate. And because we understood the psychology of how people learn and the psychology of learning, and this is why it ties into mental health, because when you're dealing with trauma, you're dealing with memories and you're dealing with how memories behave. When you're dealing with literacy, again, you're dealing with memories, because instead of trying to remove bad memories, you're trying to implant good memories, like this letter here, how do you pronounce it? This word here, how do you spell it? That kind of thing. So
it's more replacement.
Sorry?
So it's more replacement. So it's rather than trying to get rid of a bad memory, you're introducing new memories.
Yeah.
I want to talk more about your history and your background in mental health coaching and PTSD particularly. And I know this again will be applicable. And the reason I actually diverted into the political world of Palestine and Israel, because what a lot of people are going through, especially with the attacks, especially with the charged up emotions behind it, you have treated, and I'm not speaking for you, but you have dealt with people that are suffering PTSD, and a lot of people that are in those situations, Palestine or Israel, will be going through similar traumatic PTSD type incidents. I want you to speak through if anybody is, do you know this? I don't know if it's actually a word, but I'm going to use this terminology. Do you know the secondhand anxiety and trauma that people are feeling by watching or listening or hearing about it? How would they cope with something like that? So I know personally, I get really emotionally charged up about Palestine, the Palestinian lives, and genocide and things. For me, I get really, really upset about it and hurt about it, and I've cried at videos about it. But how would you tackle that not being there? How do you handle that?
Well, excellent question, because what we've learned over the years is that if you would think intuitively that if somebody suffers a traumatic incident, like they got attacked or mugged or raped or whatever, or they're in a war zone and a bomb fell near them or something like that, or lost a leg, you would think that they would be the most heavily traumatized, as opposed to the people who watched it happen. But in fact, the people it happens to can get just as traumatized as the people who watch it, who are just as traumatized as the people who cause it. So if you're a Russian conscript and you haven't got any choice, you've got to, shooting shells or whatever, you're going to get PTSD just as badly as the person who's standing next to the shell when it lands, or the person who's watching on TV. Now, obviously, if you're watching on TV, you're not going to get as traumatized, but still there's a massive traumatization factor watching this stuff, hearing about it, especially if you've got personal connections. Like I am a quarter Ukrainian. So, when bombs or missiles land in Ukraine, it's like, I take it personally. So it's you can't judge trauma. You can't say, oh, well, your incident was worse than your incident, therefore you should be more traumatized. It doesn't work like that at all. And the mechanism by which it happens is you get traumas come in chains. So you have a trauma at the age of 5, and another one at the age of 10, the other one at the age of 15, but you don't get PTSD. Eventually, a trauma happens, which is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And at that point, kapow, suddenly you've got PTSD, even though that last trauma on the chain wasn't a big one. You notice this with firemen. They can sort of dive into burning buildings and save children X number of times without getting PTSD, and then they'll go to some small incidents and suddenly, kapow, they've got PTSD. And this is quite typical. So as I say, you can't. I've had sessions to victims who've been tortured in African jails and things like that, and their trauma is you can't say it's worse or better than somebody else's. You just have to have no judgment on this. You just take every case as it comes.
So do you know if you had a situation where, like I said, do you know if you had a situation where you felt, obviously, like I said, you can't judge anybody's instances or experiences or personal feelings, and if somebody came to you with a traumatic experience that they felt like it was secondhand trauma from seeing it, being next to it, close to it, whatever it is, situation, would you treat that exactly the same way as somebody that has gone through it? or would you adjust your techniques or styles based on what type of trauma they were feeling around the circumstance, for example?
Um, well, the first rule is everybody's different.
Mm.
So the first question is, what incidents are you interested in addressing? Now, they might have been through some horrendous war experience, but what they're most interested in addressing is the death of their dog. I mean, that might sound bizarre, but that's the way it is. This is the way the mind works. You know, these traumas are like layers of an onion, and you've got to peel off the first layer before you can get the next layer. So you don't
Yeah.
just dive into the most serious trauma. And you have to be, I have to be very careful about this, because if you dive in too deep, the client gets overwhelmed. So you've got to start peeling off the outer layers first, and that enables you to then address the layers lower down. And everybody's different. So, you know, the first thing you do is what is called an intake or a history, where you say, give me a list of all your traumatic incidents and give me a list of all your traumatic relationships.
Yep.
And from that, we'll work out what are you most interested in addressing first. And after we've got that one out of the way, right, what should we address next? Because as the layers of the onion peel away, you find out what is accessible. It's not that you don't judge it by how bad an incident it was, you judge it by how accessible it is.
So do you know, something I've noticed actually over my practice over the last couple of years, because I've been doing this for a couple of years now, 2 years, I think. And something I've noticed sometimes, I think to be honest, the majority of my clients, they have a big incident. So for example, so a death in the family, or like the mum just died and they've got into a car accident that almost killed him as well, to back. But they always tend to like speaking about I say the easier stuff, the less heavy stuff on them. So it's something that they know is not as traumatizing to them. They openly mention it. They'll say, "Look, I know it's not a big deal, but this has affected me more." So I had a client the other day, actually last week, and she said to me, "Look, I know I almost died in my car accident, and I know my mum just died like yesterday. But she was like, my biggest issue is that I'm scared to drive. I'm more bothered about that than all the other issues." And she was like, "I know it's not a big deal compared to that, but that's my priority." Do you find that often people like tackling easier issues per se first and
Yes,
then delving into it?
yes, definitely.
Okay. And is that a particular reason? Is that
Well,
just because they want to be more comfortable?
no, it's not a question of comfort, really. It's just, as I say, it's whatever the outer layer of the onion happens to be. And it might be something that you might think is terribly serious, or you might think it's not terribly serious. I mean, one of the most severe traumas I ever came across was somebody who'd been burgled, and she was on holiday while the burglary took place. So there was no physical contact. She never met the burglar, and he didn't steal much. But the fact that he'd invaded her space was for her very traumatic. And you can't judge that. You
Yeah.
know, inevitably there will be traumas behind that well, there were, you know,
Yeah.
earlier in life. But this was just the one that broke the straw that broke the camel's back, as I said.
I actually have a question for you, and this is more of a personal question for me, actually, that I wanted to pull out of your podcast because I thought it was quite interesting. So I listened to a famous psychologist, and something he said once was that he said your life is basically like a timeline, and you do something and it has a consequence. You do something else has a consequence. You do something else has a consequence, and it'll keep building. And it's like what you said; it keeps building up, building up, building up. But from what he said was eventually something that you've done, like let's say 10 years ago, you haven't untangled that knot. So everything you do after will always be problematic for you. Do you believe in the same principle that you have to untie every single knot for you to recover, or is it a case of you have to untangle the right one, but then you should have a sort of a recovery or a recovery process?
Once again, everybody's different. So you can get somebody who's got a very high level of PTSD. You run one incident and kapow, that's it. I'm fine now. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yeah,
And they live
which is what
happily
we
ever
were
after.
discussing. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna
but
say we
on
were
the other hand,
discussing this before.
yeah, with people some people, you have to sort of run every single incident in their life. You know, every single time they had an argument with their mother, or every single time whatever happens. So it
Yeah,
varies enormously, and the
yeah,
only way you can work with this is to not judge anything.
yeah.
You've got to be client centered. There was a psychologist called Carl Rogers, and
Mm,
who set up these principles of like it's not what I think, it's what the client thinks. So if
Yeah.
the client says, I'm interested in running X, then we run X. I'm not going to argue.
Okay. Have you ever had a situation where you felt like you've had to turn clients away? Have you ever had an incident where you thought something is
Yes.
that's too serious to handle or too complicated to handle for you to do?
Not the serious isn't the problem. If they're involved in something unethical, that makes it very difficult. So if they're wanted by the police, this has not happened, but if they said, well, I'm wanted by the police, by the way, I wouldn't,
Yeah, obviously.
or if they're
No, but
selling drugs or anything like that, I no.
and you said something right at the beginning, just before actually we came into the recording. You mentioned that your aim, just like it was with literacy, is to build accessibility around it, increase exposure around it. And this is the same mission you have for mental health work, isn't it? To build an increase in accessibility, uh, project that mission that you had for literacy in the mental health world as well. And something we discussed was your app. And I'm intrigued about this app because it sounds like the answer everybody needs, so the solution everybody needs. Speak to me about the app, what it is, why it was brought into fruition, and how you're hoping it will make a difference.
Right. Well, first of all, right now there are quite a lot of mental health apps available, but their goal is to make you feel a bit better. And my goal is not to make anyone feel a bit better. If you want to feel a bit better, use one of those apps. I'm trying to, and this is an ongoing project. It's not like I've solved this completely. I'm on the path to doing this, and I'll take as much time and effort as necessary to achieve this. But I want to get to the state where I can actually give the app to somebody and it will cure their problems, as opposed to make them feel a bit better temporarily. Now, this is a massive, massive goal, because psychotherapists and psychiatrists never talk about cures, or hardly ever talk about cures, which I think is a big mistake, because if you don't talk about it, then you're not going to have that as a goal. And I think we should have it as a goal, because if I go to the doctor, my goal with the doctor and the doctor's goal with me is he's going to cure me. One way or the other, I mean, I might sort of die of a fatal disease, but most of the time,
hopefully not.
If I've got a problem, I mean, if my appendix is bursting, I expect him to take it out and I'll live happily ever after, without any appendix problems. But with mental health, it's a totally different situation, where there is just not enough research being into how do we fix these things. And that's why, again, clinical psychologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, very rarely talking about fixing things, because it's a dirty word, because we just want to make you feel a bit better, and thank God you didn't get any worse. But there's a horrible statistic I just read on, I think it was the WHO website, or a very reliable website, which says 26% of people who went to see a therapist for the first time didn't feel it did them any good. I mean, that's a very frightening statistic. So my goal has been, let's get something that actually works, and that I can put the statistics on the website and say, this works, look. But that's not the goal. The goal is, if I can put that up, then other people will take notice. Because at the end of the day, I'm an evangelist. I want these ideas to be put into the mental health world, to say, look, you don't have to live with what is called CPTSD, which is long-term PTSD, for 10, 20 years. This can be sorted. We can make you better. And this is what I want to get across. And I want to find the techniques to get this across. And I want to put those techniques into the app, and I want that app to work. Now, it's early days. We only launched it a month ago. We're doing trials in different countries. But this is where I want to get to, where somebody in wherever, whether it's Missouri, or whether it's in the middle of China, or the middle of Yemen, or whatever, in a war zone, says, well, I've got these symptoms of PTSD. I have a mobile phone. I will run this app, and I will, help myself get de-traumatized. That's where I want to get to.
The goal. Massive goal. Hopefully it works. Fingers crossed, because it's needed, of course. What made you get into PTSD work?
Um, I think because I had friends in California who were working with Vietnam War veterans. And at the time, and this is 40 odd years ago, there were massive levels of suicide from Vietnam War veterans. There were more Vietnam War veterans killing themselves than being killed by the Viet Cong.
Yeah.
And so this was a big issue. And why, what was causing this? What was so horrendous that it would cause this massive mental health problem? And how did that relate to everybody else's mental health problem? And that's something we didn't know at the time. So, but what happened is my friends developed this technique, which worked. I mean, it was extraordinary. It worked. I learned it. My friends learned it. We all learned it. And we all went off to our various countries and started applying this. And not just, we didn't have many Vietnam War veterans in the UK, but we had plenty of war veterans. I mean, those days, there were still people who were concentration camp survivors.
Yeah.
So I went to work at Victim Support in London, and we were having people sent to us by the police and the courts who were traumatized from having been crime victims.
Yeah.
Or a whole mixture of different types of people. And then there were people coming in who they weren't from a recent crime. They hadn't just been mugged in South London or whatever. They'd had something from 10 years ago, and they said, well, can you help me? And we did a research trial, and it was extraordinarily successful. It showed that our techniques worked. I mean, to a massive degree. And I stayed on and I worked there, and it was one of the best jobs I ever had, because there were people coming in with no expectations whatsoever. And they would say, well, they had the symptoms of PTSD, they had nightmares, they had flashbacks, they had phobias, they had anxiety, etc., etc. And, can you help me? And they had no idea that whether I could help them or not. So I'd say, well, sit down. We're going to give you up to 10 sessions. We gave them up to 10 sessions free. We were funded by the local council and a bit of money from the Home Office, I think. And we made a massive difference in their lives, and it was very, very rewarding. And then I got headhunted to do the same thing in Miami, which at the time was one of the shooting capital of America. It was like 40% of A&E admissions were gunshot wounds. It was
Wow.
I mean, the
massive numbers.
First week I was there, I heard 3 separate gunshots. It
Whoa.
wasn't a bad area. It was just,
very casual.
No more than anywhere else. But funnily enough, actually, most of the clients there weren't the gunshot victims, there was initially it was about the families of people who'd been shot and ended up in A&E. But a lot of the clients were actually domestic violence victims, and the majority of their clients, and that centre still going strong 26 years later, and it's handled, I think 15,000 people have benefited from the therapy that's been given there. So it's been a massive, massive success.
I just feel like I've said wow so many times in this conversation. I've said more wows than actually speaking. It's impressive. It's impressive.
Yeah, but what's interesting, I was very inspired by a story I heard very early on about how did they capture Al Capone? All right, the biggest gangster in America. How did they do it? And they couldn't prove that he'd shot so and so, or whatever. They got him for his taxes. But the way they got him was technology. It was the wiretap. That was a new piece of technology. It was the internet of its day, was the wiretap. And so they could listen into his telephone conversations, and it was technology that did it. So again, I feel that our solution is going to be in technology.
I'm not surprised. Look, everything's moving towards such a technology-heavy world. I don't expect it to reverse anytime soon. So it does make sense. And just briefly before we close up the podcast, you mentioned earlier, I actually know this until we had this conversation, well, the conversation before this podcast, is that you train a lot of people with your techniques, and these are professionals, not just teaching clients. You train professionals with techniques that they can go out and assist other people with. And you said it's fairly simple, and I'm going to say it quite loosely because I don't think it's going to be fairly simple, but uh, how does that even, how do you even start that approach? Is it more of a virtual thing? Do you just, if somebody comes to you and you say, look, we need some training, how do you even have that process going and start that process?
Well, this is a very good question. And the answer so far has been everything is word of mouth. So all my clients are word of mouth, all the people I've trained has been word of mouth. And I've been experimenting recently for the first time with social media. How do I do more? I want to train more people. I want people to use the app. How do I get people to use the app? How do I get more people to train? Because if I wait for recommendations, there's still going to be several million people who are never going to get to me, of course, all my colleagues. I mean, it's not just me. I have colleagues around the world. I have colleagues in America and Australia who are doing exactly what I'm doing, just as effectively as I'm doing. But some of them are employed by agencies, or some of them are in private practice, whatever. But it's the technique that's the thing. It's not my brilliance. It's, I like to think it is, but really, it's the technique. These techniques are tried and tested, and they work. And that's why I want to teach people these techniques.
You mentioned social media. I know, again, I know I said I'll jump into the kind of closing up of this podcast, but it's important. Social media is going to be a massive for your reach, and we had a previous discussion a few weeks ago about social media and its to reach. I love social media. I think it's so good if you use it right. I'll be honest, and no offense to anybody out there who's listening who does this, but I don't like people that could famous for silly videos or silly things. I think it's probably just a waste of social media views. But I think people that are doing things like you are, where you're sharing authentic knowledge, the whole point of the multi-dose podcast, authentic knowledge, and are able to do this, and have actual experience behind this. And I know you mentioned something previously when we discussed it. I said, why I don't like people that I'm not qualified and don't have experience or education or background. You went, and then you said to me something last time as well. As soon as you said it to me, I was like, oh, damn, good point. You said not everybody has to have the qualification sometimes. It's about, the knowledge and experience. As you said it in that conversation previously, I was like, oh, that's a good point, actually. Didn't think of it like that. What's your reasoning behind that? What's your reasoning behind not just the qualification, but everything else
Okay, let
as
me
well?
tell you about one of my heroes, a guy called Semmelweis. I think there's a play on in London at the moment about this guy, but I'm the only person who ever heard of him, as far as I knew until recently. Semmelweis discovered a long time ago in the 1800s somewhere that the doctors who were helping deliver babies were causing, that they were associated with more deaths of babies than when non-doctors or lay people were doing it. And he worked out, it's a whole long story. I mean, I strongly recommending looking him up on Wikipedia or whatever. This guy's amazing. He's the guy who discovered the fact that if you don't wash your hands properly and you're doing medical stuff, then you're going to spread germs and people are going to die.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. The name rang a bell. I know who you're talking about. Pussy.
But the interesting part of this story, I mean, this is, and he kind of deducted it by looking at evidence, proper scientific, all the rest of it. And he went around saying, you must wash your hands before you start delivering babies, for God's sake. Otherwise, they will die. But it took him 19 years to persuade the powers that be, all these qualified doctors, that this was the case. 19 years while children continued to die, mothers giving birth continued to die. It's not the qualifications. Yes, you need qualifications, obviously. But at the end of the day, it's breakthroughs in technique. And his was a breakthrough in technique. And it was simplest possible technique, which is wash your hands.
Wash your hands.
But it was an essential technique which changed the face of medicine.
Yeah,
and
honestly,
eventually, after 19 years, it got adopted, but it took him that long. So just go show, I mean, you look at the history. I remember, because I used to be a research fellow at the Royal Institution, which is, where they do the history of science lectures, and Faraday developed electromagnetism and all the rest of it. And I sat down with one of their professors and I said, am I right in thinking that all the great breakthroughs in science weren't immediately accepted? You know, like Galileo had to fight, you know, it's like all these people, occasionally somebody comes up with something and everybody goes, oh, marvelous, you know, we've now discovered something. But time after time after time, people invent something that works. And then comes the hard bit. They've got to market it to their peer group and to everybody else and say, please start using this. And that's the stage I'm at the moment.
It's the branding around it, the marketing around it, building the trust around it, the promise around your brand, even though it might be a new invention or, you know, a new discovery. So yeah, I knew I recognized it. I was like, why do I recognize this name? Why do I recognize this name? And as soon as you said washing hands, I remember learning about this actually.
The stage is set, the spotlight is on. This is Doses of Authenticity, where the real stories unfold, every answer reveals a new layer, and the true self shines. Let the questioning begin.
What is your number one life philosophy?
Keep trying till you get it right. Trial and error is probably the best form of learning.
How do you want to be remembered?
I think in terms of how many people I helped, or not just me, like, you know, I don't want to sound narcissistic here, but it's if I'm inventing stuff that people use, I don't care if I don't get remembered. I just want what I've invented to be remembered. That's the best way to put it.
One change you would make to society?
In schools, teach kids how people are different, how some people are sociopathic and have no empathy, and some people are nice guys.
Ooh.
Because most of the problems in the world right now, or probably forever, have been caused by sociopaths. Sociopaths sound charming, sound convincing, but they create more havoc than anybody else. You have to know what they are and how to spot them. And if you could build that into the education system, that's what I would do.
The best advice you have been given?
Actually, two of my mentors both told me to stop being so arrogant. It's a problem once you think, oh God, I've solved this or I've done this or whatever. It's very easy to get sort of big-headed about it and get kind of sound like you're arrogant.
What makes you authentic and unique?
I suppose it's my upbringing. I'm not unique. I mean, there's lots of people like me. Well, not lots, but there's quite a few people like me. But the authenticity is fine. I used to go to seminars on authenticity and I swallowed everything I learned. The uniqueness bit is, or what was different about my upbringing to most people's upbringing, is I come from a family of overachievers who are, you know, some of them quite famous or infamous, if you like. We were all trying our best to achieve whatever path we took, whether it was academic or whether it was in business or whether it was in law or whatever.
So we are closing up the podcast. Before we go, I want to say thank you for even sparing your time. You are a very busy person, as I can imagine, actually. And you've been amazing things, and I'm super glad that we've managed to get you on the podcast. And might actually have to be a part two because all the interesting stuff came out in the final 5 questions that I wanted to go through as well. Like going through traits of a sociopath, like you said, what do we actually look for in the traits of a sociopath? And I want to know. I want to know your family tree now of your overachieving family. I want to know who they are. But all jokes aside, thank you so much. Before I head off, firstly, tell people where they can find you, your website, your social medias, and any closing comments you might have.
Right. So my website is traumasol.org, traumasol.org, and that's got the app on it. You can register for the app. You can either pay very small amounts to use the app, or you can be part of our research trial, in which case you don't have to pay for the app. And it will tell you about, we do private sessions, so if you want one-to-one client counselling, we do that. And it will tell you about our training as well. So that's traumasol.org. We've recently started trying to work with social media. and it's much harder than it looks.
Tell me about it.
So this is definitely the work in progress, and we'll have more conversations with you about this.
Yep.
But our on Facebook, we're on Trauma Solution Project, and on Instagram, we're on Trauma Solution Project.
Perfect. Any closing comments?
I invite everybody who, I mean, probably, I don't know, majority of your listeners aren't going to be somebody who has a mental health problem or feels like rushing off to a therapist to get it fixed. But nearly all of us know people who do need this help, whether they should be going to a therapist or whether they should be using the app or whatever. It's up to them. So if you know somebody who you think has mental health or has told you they have mental health problems, please pass the word on. There are solutions, and in whatever way we can help, we'd like to help.
Yeah. Do you know what, honestly, again, thank you so much. I do want to give my own recommendations on Victor. You check his website out. You'll probably end up trusting him yourself. As you tell from the conversation, he has a arrogant personality. I'm joking. He's got a really good personality, really easy to speak to. Very, very, very excited and very happy that you came on the podcast. So we're going to close it here, guys. And all the links will be in the description below everywhere and across all social medias.